My name is David Evans. I am an Australian currently based in the UK, and I work for a small company called Nuri. It's just me and this random Serbian guy. Okay, it's Gojko. On average between us, we've written 3 books each. That's because Gojko's written 6. I haven't written any. But, you know, I'm happy to bathe in reflected glory. So this story, well, this talk is about stories. And a lot of what I do these days, although sort of obviously my background is testing and development, I'm finding that the main source of problems that I see affecting quality and agile teams is that people sort of still struggling with how they get good use out of stories, especially with people perhaps trying to adopt some of the ideas we propose, like specification by example and so forth. They sort of say, well, okay, but we sort of get what that's about, but we also have stories, and what is it that what goes where? What should we be doing? There's also a bit of a feeling of, well, we're not sure how much should we be writing down, how much detail do we need, and how much sort of should be just lightweight and cards and stickies on the board. I think one of the main problems too is just story is actually quite an overloaded term. And it sort of shouldn't be the case, but we sort of still have these multiple, slightly inconsistent, possibly even conflicting definitions. So for many people, the story is just, the physical manifestation. It's the card, it's the thing they stick on the wall. For others, they think of it as a particular phrasing. So they'll say, well, the story is as a I want, so that. For others, the story is whatever their electronic version is. It might be a ticket in a Jira system or something like that. There are the people who sort of perhaps take the more pure approach and say, well, the story is nothing. The story is the conversation, or the story is the promise to hold a conversation. They say all the proper details of the story really exist in people's heads and exist in the interactions that we have between people. So, I'm sympathetic to all these things, but I think where we get slightly more difficult is where we start to slip in other terms. So if you're applying BDD and perhaps using Cucumber feature files, you think, okay, well, I've got a feature file, so I'm now describing a feature. Now, is that a story or not? When we say, well, create specifications and specifications with examples, is that the same as a story or is it different? What's going on there? Maybe you use use cases. How are they similar or different to stories? So all of these are symptoms of the kind of lack of clarity, I think, that exists in the industry around how to use these and use them well. So I picked out 3 things that I think are fairly pernicious problems or barriers to understanding of the use of stories in teams. And it's really, the exceptions to the rules, the assumptions that we don't sort of clarify, and ambiguity in the language that we use. So I'm going to explore some of those things. I mentioned I'm an Australian expatriate currently living in England, and Australians living in the UK tend to get accused of being whingers. And I think it's true that for those who don't live in Britain, this is really how it looks. It's grim up north, it's crowded in the south, but there is this sort of rather nice little corner of the country that is known as the Cotswolds, and I'm lucky enough to live there. So it's just like you imagine from the chocolate box lids. It's all rolling hillsides and honeystone buildings and thatched cottages and so forth. This is a picture of the school that my kids are lucky enough to go to. So it's the old stately home of a guy called Noel Wills. The Brits might recognize that name because he was founder of the Wills tobacco empire and became very rich that way. So it's a fags to riches story. I'm going to go meta here, okay? So if people digress a little bit, that's another problem with stories. Product owners often like to hear the sound of their own voice and give a bit of background and context, but Make sure people stay on topic. Anyway, so, okay, it's a nice old pre-Victorian building, which kind of means that in making it useful in the modern day, they've had to sort of, cope with modern things like vehicles instead of horse-drawn carriages and so forth. So there's a rather sort of long, circuitous one-way system around the grounds of this place. That sort of means you approach the building here and through this one-way system, and you go up to the main school, and then to leave you have to sort of come over a little narrow, quaint bridge, and you pass through the stable block here. All very nice. But you can see that it's fairly hard for something like a school bus to get through some of these gaps. So the school buses that sort of bus kids in from further afield sort of they have to sort of make a little exception for those. And this is sort of annotated here in this sign in the wall here. I'll zoom in on that. So the one-way system does not apply to very large vehicles, which kind of means that it's all very good, it's a safe thing, everyone's going the same direction, except you might come around this corner and find something very big coming in the opposite direction. And I think this is a classic example of the sort of things we treat as if they're footnotes to the main rule. We'll have stories, we'll have specifications that say, yep, this is the case, this is the way the rule works. Oh yeah, but think about it, except for that. And it tends to be like this little note, the really big stuff doesn't have to do the same thing that you do. And I think we don't perhaps give enough time and thought to what are the consequences of those exceptions. Are we really just leaving them as, oh, okay, yeah, we'll deal with that case when we come to it, instead of thinking, does that invalidate our entire model? So I think there's risk associated with exceptions. Be aware of that. Okay, another problem is things we assume but don't make explicit. Most modern toilets these days sort of have this sort of dual flush system to save water, don't they? And various designers have approached this in, I guess, somewhat obvious ways. You've usually got a 2-button system. There's some visual cue on there that shows which button you press is going to deploy less water or more water. But look at this design here. It's just sort of it's a pull the handle kind of thing. So firstly, it's not obvious that there is a dual flush option on this, but I can tell you that there is. So what would you assume? How would you approach this? If you were a good earth-conscious person, you wanted to sort of use less water, how might you approach that? Well, something, yeah, that seems reasonable. Something like that, either sort of halfway or sort of quickly down and let go or something like that. I think the designers found they had so much confusion with the use of this, they then had to annotate this, had to express the rules on here. So it was an advertising opportunity. So Dudley Duo Flush, the way that's designed is that you hold it down to get less water out. I think that's a bit bizarre. So for reduced flush, yeah, I just don't get it. So the very fact that we've had to, put some instructions on something that should be as intuitive and obvious as, the flush device on a toilet suggests that maybe the assumptions we made about the way people would approach this problem, or the things that we would assume about how to use this, were completely wrong. But I thought it was interesting that the way they solved the problem was to try and sort of, munge on a bit of documentation rather than just fix the design in the first place to make it more intuitive. So beware of unspecified assumptions and how that might affect your user's sense of quality. Ambiguity. There's if I'd been a bit more sophisticated with my AV, I'd have played the song here. But there's a great song called Lola by the Kinks, and I'm an old enough guy. That's kind of my thing. And I'll give you a bit of time to read the lyrics because they're quite good. But essentially, it's the story of a young man sort of who's just left home and finds himself in the seedier end of London, and encounters somebody who might not be quite what he thinks she is at first appearance. There's a particular stanza down the bottom here where he says, well, I'm not the world's most masculine man, but I know what I am, and I'm glad I'm a man, and so is Lola. And I thought, well, it's wonderful poetry. I mean, it's great lyrics, because that's kind of the heart of what creativity is about, is sort of playing with your head and sort of seeing the different things that we can slot in. But unfortunately, in software development, that kind of ambiguity is our enemy. So, you know, if we try to parse that particular stanza, just, you know, how does this work out? You know, we got a couple of definites. You know, I can complete this part of the truth table, but you know, it really depends on where I put the brackets, doesn't it? So what am I glad about? And if Lola is something, Lola is X. Where does the X apply? And so you can imagine. Well, we try to sort of put this into code, and you know, there's all sorts of possibilities. Now, specification by example suggests that we need to sort of get in a room and discuss this and be open about, you know, our identities and so forth, and just start getting some facts in here, replace these question marks with some definites. What we don't want is to sort of, you know, have to sort of make these decisions in code. So, the fact that we end up with, you know, a description that sort of seems to work when we're just discussing things as human beings, but we end up needing to codify this, is an example of translation. So this translation is inevitable. We can't really avoid that. We can discuss things, we think we understand it, but things need to happen in code. So let's look at this topic of translations. I learned a bit of German in high school, but I can't claim to be good at it. But I'm going to do my best to say this. So there's a little bit of poetry that reads: Es brillig war, die schlichte Toven, wirten und wimmelten in Waben, und alle mumsige Burgoven, die Momen rath als Graben. Now there are some Germans in the audience, I hope. Stefan, at least I know. Can you tell us what this means?
No, I can't. No,
was there something wrong with my pronunciation?
No, that was pretty good. But you know, this being part of a poem that I know, it's just nonsense language. And to be honest, I think it looks a bit like a few specifications that I've seen. It's incomprehensible to anyone.
Well, maybe.
And yet it's fun.
Maybe we need a better product owner then. Does anyone speak Spanish? Spanish? Ah, brilliant. Have a volunteer here.
I just have to move a bit.
Because I couldn't possibly read this and get it right.
So I'm going to try. So, cosillaba el día y las tobas aguilimosas giroscopaban y barrenaban en la alarde. Todos debirables estaban los burgobos y silbramaban las alecas rastas.
Excellent. So does that mean what that says?
I have no idea what the German version says. But most of the words are not really real words. Right?
I'm liking the look of this. What does that mean?
Well,
Agilimosas.
I'm choosing to choose that agile means agile, right?
Yeah.
So mosas is something slimy or something slippery.
Agile and slippery. Maybe I'm not attracted to that one after all.
Probably if we draw a picture, it's gonna look better than in words.
What about gyroscopaban? I like that word.
It's not really a word. It's like the submarines. They are having the gyroscope.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing they are turning around and looking around.
Okay. All right. Well, let's try one more. Dutch. Hyde. Thank you.
Het was bradig en de slijptorfs triltolden op de wijde weep. Misbrozig stonden borrelgorfs het verdoolde grasvark schreep.
Wonderful.
Cool.
Because I would never have got that. That was pretty awesome. Okay, what does that mean then?
It's nothing really.
You guys are useless. I was so impressed with these multilingual people. I'm not getting any closer to meaning. Okay, what this sliply, how is that pronounced? Slipe. Okay, what does that bit mean then? Yeah? Well, I think you're all a bit rubbish. Here it is in English. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves, did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogroves, and the mome raths outgrabe. So there we are. It's all clear now. These are, of course, all translations, very, very good ones, I believe, of just the first stanza of a fairly famous poem called Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll. And you know, there are many other stanzas in that poem. I'm sure many of you know it. But it's full of nonsense. It's kind of a really appealing and beautifully written poem that just doesn't mean anything. Although if you're familiar with the book from which this comes, when it's from Through the Looking Glass, the sequel to Alice in Wonderland, Alice and Humpty Dumpty do have a bit of a go at trying to understand what each of these things mean, so it's explained, for example, that brillig is a particular time of day. It's 4 in the afternoon, but specifically it's the time that you start putting the food on to broil for supper. The slithy toves, though, that's these guys here. They're sort of like described as a cross between a badger and a corkscrew. And they are, they're slithy. They're sort of live. They're a bit slimy. So I think that sort of agilimosos was quite a good translation of that. Bit slippery, bit live, bit sly perhaps. And garring and gimbling is about sort of twisting and making holes. Mimsy, or mimsy with the borogoves, this rather sort of strange-looking bird here. Mimsy was described as sort of being, you know, flimsy and miserable and something like that. And the mome raths, these are these pig-like creatures in the background, far from home. What they do when they outgrabe, I don't know. But you can sort of see, you know, die Mormen rath ausgraben. You don't sort of, you know, it's isomorphic. That sort of makes this poem quite magical when it's translated. We sort of haven't needed to get down to literal meanings of things. We've gone for suggested meanings. And we've said, all right, well, given the feel of those words in English, given the sort of things they suggest in what they evoke, what we mean rather than what they actually mean, can we do something isomorphic in another language? And so that's why I think these translations are really, you know, works of great genius, really, because when you think about how many levels of association are going on, it's really quite interesting. So if linguistics are your thing, I suggest go and look. There's dozens of other translations in other languages. You can find it on Wikipedia. The point, of course, is that whilst, as I say, attractive in literature and the arts, ambiguity and uncertainty and mistranslation is our enemy in software development. So that, if I zoom back, of course, was not a picture of the real world. In the real world, we sort of follow strict rules like this. So, you remember surely there's a golden rule of requirements management and software development and design that says you should never presume solution design in specifying your requirement. And there's all sorts of good reasons for that. We don't want to constrain design. We want to focus on outcomes rather than mechanics. We want to make sure that we give implementation teams maximum opportunity for innovation and so forth. And therefore, the requirement should always be about focusing on what's going to be valuable, what's the outcome that we're trying to achieve, and then we can have a separate discussion about what's the best design that solves that. But, okay, so if we know that requirements and design should be kept apart, well, what is a story? When we sort of start to shrink the timelines in which we create requirements and create designs, it sort of starts to blur the line between these things. And this, I think, is where the problem comes. Many people just will simply describe, use story and requirement interchangeably. And I think that falls foul of this problem. Because, to be honest, most stories that I see, or most expressions of stories, are very much about the design. And the requirement is almost tacked on as a little bit of an afterthought. It's almost the justification for why we're going to do X now. So if I try to unpick this, this is sort of what I come up with. And I'm indebted to Dan North, who sort of came up with this idea of saying for any story, there is always two domains. There's the domain of the business, and then there's the domain of the technical solution. And it's very important that we sort of understand what we're talking about when we're discussing the details of a story. The other reason that I like that separation is that I personally dislike the very commonly used story format that goes, as a stakeholder, I want some feature so that some value ensues. Now, it has its merits. I like the simplicity of I want to know who, what, and why, but I don't like the order in which it's expressed. So Dan North and the BDD people say, here's a better idea. Start with, rephrase it slightly. Start with, in order to gain some value, I want some solution, some feature. That puts the two parts in the right sequence as far as I'm concerned. It says, we start with a problem, now let's discuss a possible solution to it. So, in an extreme form, you could imagine that when we're discussing requirements, all we have is that first phrase. All we have is an understanding of this is something valuable. I want to solve this, and it might be. I tend to characterize requirements as sort of coming from three possible types. It's either some innovative idea that we believe is going to be, surprise and delight our customers. It might be something that has been explicitly asked for, so it's pulled by a customer need, or it might be that we've got some problem, some defect in our system that we need to fix. All of those are essentially, a requirement. Now, I acknowledge that there's a lot of other useful stuff you can do that sort of sit above or sit to the left of the process of defining those requirements. Impact mapping is obviously something that we are particularly keen on, but there's other techniques like product roadmaps and envisioning workshops and so forth that are useful tools for helping you to understand what those requirements are. So don't ignore the fact that deciding or identifying requirements is not an easy task, and there are other things that you should use to do that. But essentially, what we end up with is the expression of the business need. Now, that's sort of like a proto-story, if you like. That's a story in gestation. For the story to actually be useful to a team to be able to take into a sprint, we obviously need to go the next step. And that's where I think this definition of the story being a promise to hold a conversation is quite a nice definition, because we don't really, we can't use the story until we've had that conversation that says, okay, here are some possibilities about how we can solve this. So I think in an ideal world, I can imagine, I could imagine a simple expression of a problem that we need to address, being put to a team, and then the team is, we say, okay, what might we do about this? Let's iterate through some possible solution options here until we settle on something that we think, yes, given this discussion, given the balance of risk and reward, we select something that we say, this is the thing that we're going to do. And that sort of really equates to your I want clause in your story. It's the description of the feature that we're going to add or the change that we're going to make. So I would call that a design sketch. It's really just a one-line expression of the thing that we're going to do. Once we've settled on that and we've agreed this is the thing, so we've used our knowledge about the requirements effectively to prioritize what we're going to do. Once we've understood that, once we've got our decision, then really the focus for the story is, okay, what is it? What are the details of this change? So I don't want to imply that sort of any one part of that clause is more important than the other. It's just that I think the requirement is that the business need expression helps us to understand what is the order in which I should do things. What is the value of this? The solution part is the stuff that's useful to the team. We already know we have to do this. What is it? How are we going to do this? How do we do it safely? So I'd say that the story gets us to an agreed change, and once we understand what that change is, then our focus shifts. We say, all right, what are the details of that? So that's where we sort of start to look at, okay, how do I specify this change through perhaps the use of specification by example, but for those who are not particularly using that technique, the equivalent is, what are my acceptance tests for this change? So here's I'm not dictating the way you use things, but this is again a sort of syndrome that I see with this as I want so that. It's usually evident in the fact that, as I say, that the change that people want is almost just gratuitously wrapped up in some kind of structure. And so you could just as easily say, well, I have a story like this, which is expressed, say from the context of the owner of a business. Here we imagine we're in a system where we've got a car park that people can pay for parking. So it might be, is it the car park operator's perspective that says, all right, this is the feature that I want, multi-day parking, and the business value for that is that that's going to make it more convenient and bring more drivers in, I'll make more profit? Or is it better to say, well, no, it's the user who's they're the stakeholder in this story, and I don't want to have to keep ringing this phone number every day when I come here Monday to Friday. I'd rather just make one call. The point is that really, both of those end up with the same thing, and I therefore have my doubts as to whether the ASA is a good starting point for stories. I think it's often just noise. Use it if it gives you a benefit, but I see a lot of as the system or as a product owner or as a user, very, very sort of generic and not helpful expressions of that stakeholder phrase. And I think if you're starting to do that in your stories, just get rid of that. Don't use a format just for the sake of it. So if we swap this into the sort of BDD style where we put the business value first, it might look something like, in order to save time for drivers, and therefore it's stakeholder neutral. We know the drivers want to save time, and we know that the car park owner knows that's a good thing. So we don't really need to specify who is the person benefiting from that. But yeah, so business value is saving time for drivers, and the change is we will allow multi-day parking in one call. So what that gives us, if we decompose that a little, is the opportunity to say, all right, we now got something we can critique. So if we just split those lines out. So the first bit is in order to, so that's your sort of boilerplate. I always say the phrase that follows this, I like to say, start it with some kind of qualifier or relative. It's what is the thing we're doing. So I like the words improve or reduce or save or increase. Anything that's going to give us a change to something that we can put some kind of measurable value on. So we should be able to say, well, what is our measure of the time it takes for drivers to pay? Do we have some kind of metrics on that? Do we have something that represents what is the scale of acceptability? What's too slow? What's fast enough? So yeah, if we want to save time, how much time do we need to save for this story to be valuable? Do we have measures of this? And is saving time the most important thing? Are our drivers perhaps complaining about something else other than the time it takes? And then for your solution design phrase, again, we say, all right, so I've just changed it, I want, because I want to make it stakeholder neutral. It's really the fact is we've committed to make a change as a team, so this is from the team's perspective, if you like. So we will do something, and the do something in this case is allow multi-day parking in one call. So I always suggest start that phrase with a verb, where that really focuses on this is the thing that will be true in the future that is not true now. So I can look at that statement and say, so therefore, is it true that at the moment we do not allow multi-day parking? And if the product owner says, yes, that's right, then we know we've got a well-expressed phrase. But as we said, it might be that the product owner has come with this fully formed and said, multi-day parking, we need to do that absolutely right now. It'll just allow us to say, well, okay, is that the thing that's going to save most time for drivers? Are there other solutions we could implement? So when we've now sort of committed to this and we're doing a story and we're putting it up on our task board, our storyboard, I like clarity I do like physical card walls, I think they're great, but I want clarity. I find it frustrating that even when you've got a classical Scrum team having their daily stand-up, everyone's sort of standing in one place, discussing who's doing what today and what they achieved yesterday, even within sort of a meter of the wall, people sort of aren't referring directly to cards. And it's often because, if you have used this as a I want so that, your cards sort of end up looking something like this, just full of noisy text, and even, from a meter away, let alone from the kind of distance you guys are at, you couldn't see what that's about. So people don't refer to things consistently. You certainly don't say, oh, well, I'm working on as a frequent user, I want to pay for multi-day parking so that I don't have to pay each day story. Whereas if we just stripped it down to the bit that came from the solution phrase, then it looks a bit more like that. So you might not see it from there, but at least you've got a fighting chance of seeing it at your stand-up, and it's the thing you can talk about. Okay. So the specification and our acceptance tests are things that are separate from the story. Okay, these are not part of the story themselves. These are the consequence of the story. They are how we make this change safely. So, which leads us to an important distinction here, that the story and the specification are separate, and they're separate for good reason. Story is short-lived. Specification is long-lived. So the story is about what is the change I'm making. The specification is about what is the effect of that change. How does that change our documentation about the behavior of our system? And so it also means that we've got obviously our physical manifestations, things like cards and tasks and so forth. They're just scheduling conveniences. When the story is done, you can tear up that card and put it in the bin. You're certainly not going to tear up your specifications. You're going to put that in your living documentation system and keep that because that's returning you long-term value. But it also makes an interesting distinction between acceptance criteria and acceptance tests, because I often get asked this, is there a difference? Well, for some the difference is the level of detail, but for me it's the fact that these are sort of like one-off checks, whereas these are things I want to be checking all the time. So your acceptance criteria really might be a prototype of acceptance tests, because you're starting to think of, okay, I need to test that this and this case hold true. But you might also have acceptance criteria that say, get marketing to okay the color scheme. Now, it's a perfectly valid acceptance criteria. We know the story isn't done until we've got that checked, but it doesn't really form part of our permanent regression suite. So really, acceptance criteria are the things we could tick off on the back of the card. Acceptance tests are the things we want to keep running as regression tests after the story is complete. So if we've got a specification, if we've got things that we're going to keep, what is it that we need to put in that? And these are sort of my basic rules. Basically, you put down the things that you've made a decision about. So anything that's a decision that sits within your own domain, that's business rules that need to be kept and documented and visible to product owners. And of course, as I say, if you're using specification by example, then the examples that support those rules form part of that documentation. And you know, I think it's healthy to wrap these things with whatever relevant context or background information is necessary. Okay, we need to wrap up soon. I've tried to make this talk a little bit different, but there's sort of one last thing that I might try. What is this? Oh, close. Who did you say? What? A 2x2. Brilliant. Yes. It's actually my test management tool. Test faster, damn it. No. You're right. It's a 2x2. And it's a particularly useful thing for doing DIY work around the house, because it's a very sort of generally useful size for stud work and things like that. So yeah, I don't suggest beating anyone in the head with it, but I'm hoping you'll remember 2x2. So what do we do with the 2x2? Well, I find that when people are trying to start off with specifications, they struggle a bit with how much detail do I need to put in these things, and they find it hard to sort of come up with these test tables, which might end up being quite big. And so I say, well, look, if you're struggling with this, if you need to know how do I start with a 2x2. Not the stick, it's a 2x2 matrix. And it really says it divides my problem into these four things. I want to have, what is the simplest expression of a positive case that shows this change is implemented? So I need to focus therefore on try to express a single expression of the input and a single expression of the output or expected behavior. And I also want to counterbalance that with, well, when does this not occur? So what is the default that's occurring now, which means that we're left with existing behavior, because it helps us to focus on highlighting how is that different from this behavior. So the trigger is about, yeah, what aspects, what circumstances lead us to this new behavior occurring. So we need to think, what are all the factors that are input, and what are all the outputs. So that's really just that gives you a starting point conceptually. The idea is that you don't need to worry about specifics. You're just trying to wrap as many things into those cells as you can before you then decompose them. It's, you can sort of see how these things go. The normal case is you do a proper presentation. You talk about the quadrants and all that sort of stuff. But if you've been affected by the crazy mad Serb, then you do something different. So yes, imagine we're back in the multi-day parking issue. We're just trying to say, okay, basically, if we offer multi-day parking, then this is what it looks like. I'm either, at the moment, the default is we assume you only park for 1 day, but we're going to be able to offer that you can select how long you park for, and therefore if I park for 2 days, then that changes the details of my parking voucher. So my default parking voucher, what happens at the moment, is that it's costs £5 and it expires at the end of the day. Whereas if I said, I want to park for 2 days, it's going to cost me £10 and it'll expire tomorrow. So, you don't need any more detail than that to sort of say, okay, is that, what else goes in here? Is there anything else that I need to add in here? Is there anything else I need to add in there? It's really just your starting point that gives you the parameters of your change. And it means you can then start to decompose in perhaps one axis at a time. It's not necessarily the right way to do it, but it just means, okay, let's park some of the details and just sort of explore one aspect. So if we focused on the input, the period, we can say, okay, well, 1 day £5, 2 days £10, etc. But then it makes you think, okay, is there a limit? Can I specify 500 days? Would that make sense? Well, no. We'll limit it to 7 days, and therefore we'll return some kind of error message if you try to choose more than that. So then, having discussed that, we need to sort of factor that into our rules. So you see we added a little thingy here. Then you might sort of say, well, okay, maybe the product owner has a bright idea and says, well, to draw attention to this feature, maybe we'll offer a discount. Maybe 35 is a bit high. How about we offer only £20 for 7 days? That would be good. Then you sort of open up other discussions, and you can say, all right, well, the sharp-eyed testers say, okay, well, if you're only charging £20 for 7 days, what if I ask for 5 days? Am I going to be charged £25? And then, oh, no, okay, all right, well, no, we've got to do the right thing by the driver. We've got to make sure they are offered the best price and so forth. So, you get some interesting cases like this where the relationships perhaps aren't as obvious as they first were. Anyway, you're now into sort of classic specification workshop type territory where you can explore these possibilities. But you've sort of allowed yourself to get started because you simplified the problem in the first place, and then you gradually factor out and expand as you need to. Okay, well, I think that's my time limit, so that's really the whole of the talk. Thanks very much.